Hey guys, I'm Jade. Today is my LeetCode review vlog on the 73rd problem. We have to state matrix zeros. We are given an m times n integer matrix. If an element is zero, we'll set its entire row and column to zeros. Let's say example 1 here. We got 0 inside a 3 times 3 matrix, and we have to say the second row and the second column, all the elements inside them, to 0. Then, let's get started with our intuition to solve the problem. So, the key point is, we'll use the matrix first row, use the matrix first row and first column to store which rows and columns should be 0. And there are 4 detailed steps we have to do. The first step, we have to check if the first row and first column should need to be 0. If so, we have to record it and record it. And the second step, we'll use the first row and column to mark zeros. Use the first row and column to mark which row and column should be 0. And the third step, we have to set the element at the corresponding position to be 0 based on the marks we set on the second step. To 0 based on the marks. And the final step, we'll correct the first row and the first column based on the initial check. Correct the first row and column based on the first check. Then, let's get started with our implementation code and detailed notes. So the very first step, we'll create several variables to help us solve the problem. Let's say first row 0, and start it at false. Then we'll update the first row 0 variable in the further code. And we have the second first column, second variable called first column 0, and started at false 2. And the third variable, let's say integer m is equal to matrix.length, which is the number of rows. And we can have integer n be assigned to matrix of 0.length, which is number of columns. And the next step, we have to check if the first column and row should be 0. If the first column and row should be 0 at the final state. And let's check for the column first. We can have a for loop. Let's say integer I started at 0 and I should be less than m, because m stands for the length of the column. And we have to increment n. And inside for loop, we have to check matrix of I of 0 is equal to 0. If so, we'll set first column 0 variable to true, and then we can break the for loop as we already got the answer. And then let's check for the first row, and the code is very similar. Let's say integer I starting at 0 and j should be less than n, and we have to increment j. And inside for loop we have to check matrix of 0 of j is equal to 0. If so, we have to set first row 0 to true and break the for loop. And the next step, we have to use the first row and first column to mark zeros for corresponding rows and columns. And we have to create a nested for loop. Let's say integer I started at 1. This is because we have already checked the first row and first column. So I will start it at 1, and I should be less than n, and increment I. And the second for loop, we'll need to create a j variable starting at 1, 2, and j should be less than n, and increment j of each iteration. And inside the second for loop, we have to check if the current element is 0. If so, we have to set ith row and the jth column should be 0. We'll update the mark if matrix of I of j is equal to 0. We have to set matrix of I of 0 to be 0. And this mark is very important because we have to say the corresponding element to be 0 based on these marks of 0 of j to be 0. And this is the first nested for loop. And let's come to the next step. We'll have another nested for loop to set corresponding elements to 0 based on the marks we got at the last state. And the code is very simple. Let's say integer I started at 1, I should be less than n, and increment I. And we have our second for loop, integer j started at 1, j is less than n, and increment j. Then we have to check if we set the current element to 0 based on the mark at matrix of I 0 and matrix of 0 j. If matrix of I of 0 is equal to 0, or matrix of 0 of j is equal to 0. If so, we'll set matrix of I of j to 0. And this is the second nested for loop. And then let's come up to the final state. And for the final state, we just check and correct the first row and the first column. Correct the first row and column. And let's check for the column first. First column 0. If so, we have to set all the elements at the first column to be 0. We can have a for loop to help us. Integer I starting at 0, I less than n, and increment I. And inside it, we just set matrix of I of 0 to be 0. And there is similar state to the first row. First row 0. If so, we can have another for loop integer j started at 0, j is less than n, and increment j. We have to state matrix of 0 of j to 0. Then let's check for the correctness. And let's analyze the time and space complexity. So the time complexity should be big O of, the time complexity should be big O of m times n. And m and n stands for the length of rows and columns. And this is because we only iterate. We iterate over the entire matrix multiple times, but the number of the time is a constant number. And the space complexity, it is big O of n, which is the problem description asks us for. We have to do it in place. This is because we use the first row and first column to record the mark if the corresponding row and corresponding column should be 0. And we also create several extra variables here to help us solve the problem. But the number of those extra variables, it is constant number. So our final time complexity is big O of n. And this is the end of my LeetCode review vlog on this problem. And I really recommend you guys visit my top 150 LeetCode quick review notes online GitHub page here. And you can see the detailed notes on this page. Oops, I forgot to upload the notes on my online GitHub page. And I create this online GitHub page by the docsify on this GitHub repository here. You can also check those source codes and assets and notes on this GitHub repository. And thank you guys for your watching. I'll see you next time.